seems to have this extra thing, this glow, which is what we call consciousness. It's not really a glow, of course, it's not actually lighting up, but there somehow seems to be something that we describe, that we like to describe or gesture at by talking of this inner light, this glow, whatever. So let's just try and think about this a little bit more carefully, consciousness. It's a rather sad-looking person here looking at an apple. Let's just start with some very basic claims about consciousness that I think everyone will agree with, whatever their views about consciousness. When you attend to something perceptually, that is, when you take notice of something perceptually, when you focus your attention on something, as this person is looking at this apple, then you have a conscious experience of it. Okay, if your senses are working properly, if you attend to something visually, or if you attend to a sound, or consider a smell, then you have a conscious experience of it. And this experience, what does it do? Well, one thing it does is it provides you with information about the object. It tells you about its size and shape and color and distance, and so on. And it prepares you to respond to it. That's the function of perception, isn't it? It's to tell us about the world around us and prepare us to respond to it. That's what the brain is. That's what the brain is for, really. It's to enable us to make our way through the world in a successful way by detecting what's there and preparing us to respond to it. Preparing us by adjusting all sorts of other psychological settings, if you like, by activating appropriate memories, associations, beliefs, desires, by forming intentions to act and so on. This is what the brain is in the business of doing, of creating future, as Daniel Dennett puts it, creating the next, preparing the next stage in our engagement with the world. Now, so that's one way of characterizing consciousness. It's having these kind of experiences, this engagement with the world, getting information and preparing to respond. But we also have what we might call non-conscious experiences. This is quite uncontroversial, really. Everyone is familiar, I think, that we can take in information about the world without our really noticing it. As if you imagine if you're walking down a busy street, you continually sort of adjust your behavior to avoid hitting obstacles and other people without really attending to it. Your visual system takes in a lot of information and uses it to guide your behavior without your really paying much attention to it. Think about driving. If you're driving a long journey, sometimes you go into a sort of autopilot mode. Now, maybe you're not completely unconscious there. I mean, you're certainly not unconscious in the sense of being asleep, but you're not consciously attending to what's happening. Your brain is taking information, using it, but not really generating the rich kind of conscious experience that you would have if you really attended to something. And this is sometimes called subliminal perception because it's a bit below the threshold for consciousness. So the idea is as if there's a sort of level that something has to get to be conscious, and if it doesn't reach that level, then it's subliminal. And so we might just say that consciousness is whatever it is, whatever features the first kind of experience has, the attentive experience has, that the subliminal perception doesn't have. What makes the difference between the two? That's what consciousness is. And I think that's a way of thinking about consciousness that pretty much everybody can agree with. There are these distinctively conscious experiences, and we can just take everyday examples of them, attending to the apple and so on. And it's what distinguishes those from the more automatic kind of engagement with the world, the more automatic information acquisition, if you like. And one common account of what that is that derives from neuroscience and cognitive science is that information, sensory information, is conscious when it is globally broadcast within the brain. So the idea here is that our sense organs detect, react to stimuli, to light waves from the apple, radiation from the apple, electromagnetic radiation from the apple. They send signals to the brain, to the sensory cortices. These regions then process the signals. They detect different features, edges, motion, color. They put these features together to categorize what's seen, that it's an apple, some other object. And then, if attention is activated, if we attend to that, to the object that we're seeing, this information that's been assembled by the sensory processing areas is globally broadcast in the brain to other regions for memory, emotion, reasoning, planning, and so on, language. So it's globally broad. This information is made available to lots of other control systems within the brain so that they can use the information to guide our behavior in all sorts of ways. And these systems then in turn generate a whole wide range of reactions, both psychological, in terms of associations, memory, decisions, beliefs, desires, and so on, and behavioral. They actually influence how you react to the world. And those reactions in turn shape how you're going to respond to the next round of stimulation. Okay. So if you see something that's, say, threatening to you, then that provokes reactions that make you cautious and perhaps ready to run away or whatever. If you see something that's attractive, like an apple, say, and you're hungry, then it prepares you to engage with the thing and to take the thing and perhaps to eat it. So the idea then is that what's distinctive of conscious experience is that the information that's taken in is globally broadcast. It's made available to lots and lots of other systems in the brain, and of course available to language, so that you can say what you're seeing. You can say, I'm seeing an apple. Whereas in the case of subliminal perception, you're not able to do that. So we might summarize that broadly with these two big arrows: information coming in, reactions going out. In a cyclical process, because the reactions then prepare you for the next round of information. And so we could just say, well, that's what consciousness is. It's just this kind of it's this global broadcast. It's information becoming, as Daniel Dennett puts it, famous within the brain. Famous where face gets in the newspapers and on television and in social media and gets to have a wide effect, a wide impact in society. So that's what makes a bit of information conscious, when it gets to have a wide impact in the brain, in the cognitive system. So sensory information is conscious when it reaches a wide range of control systems. And here's a little quote from Dennett, which I like. Consciousness is cerebral celebrity. It's being famous in the brain. Nothing more and nothing less. Those contents are conscious, that persevere, that monopolize resources long enough to achieve certain typical effects on memory, control of behavior, and so on. So it's a very dynamical picture of consciousness. For my perception of the apple to be conscious is for information about the apple that's been taken in by my senses to have a substantial impact on the rest of my mind, on the rest of my cognitive system. Now, so roughly you could think of consciousness in this sense as being an engagement with the world. Okay, it's being connected to being conscious of the apple is being connected to the apple by these information, that's the red arrows, and reaction, the green arrows. Okay, it's to be sort of locked onto the apple, tuned into it, like tuned into a signal. Okay, now explaining consciousness, so suppose we think of consciousness in that way. Well, explaining it isn't going to be easy, because these processes are immensely complex. We're talking, I have just two arrows there, but we're talking about processes that involve interactions among billions of brain cells, billions of neurons, massively interconnected. The brain is the most complex system we know of. And understanding how all this works is an immense task. But it doesn't seem impossible. We have an idea of how to do it. A characterized consciousness there in terms of certain functions that the brain performs. Information, taking in information, processing that information, using that information to control behavior. All of those notions are ones we can get a grip on. We can build artificial systems that can do very simple versions of that. Build artificial robotic systems that do things a bit like that in a very simple way. And we just have to understand how the brain performs. We just have to work out how the brain performs these functions at a much more complex level. There doesn't seem any deep mystery here. We just need to work out how the brain does all that. Because we characterize consciousness in terms of a function, in terms of functions, in terms of what it does. And we just need to find out, identify, and understand the biological mechanisms which do the relevant work. It's a bit like understanding how a piece of technology works, like a television or a computer. At first sight, it might seem magical that it does it, but we can understand it if we start to learn about the electronic machinery inside it and how that works and how it manages to do all the wonderful things that the thing does. It's a matter of explaining functions, and that in itself is not deeply mysterious. It's deeply complicated, but not deeply mysterious. So thinking consciousness in this way it presents it as a difficult but not impossible scientific problem. But there's another way of thinking of consciousness, and this is the way that Dali picked up on, the program picked up at the beginning. And it's quite a common way, and it creates a very different perspective on consciousness. And this is the idea that consciousness is something extra, over and above all those informational and reactive processes that I talked about. Something else is going on. There's not just a matter of the brain taking in information about the apple and using that information to react to the apple. There's also some internal private event, the experience of the apple, the awareness of what it's like to see the apple, what it's like to hear a sound or to have a pain or whatever. There's some qualitative aspect to all of this that is not a matter of information used, but of a pure experience, a pure feel, a pure what it is likeness. The idea is that it's like something to see the apple. There is this experience of redness and roundness and shininess or whatever that goes with seeing an apple. And this seems to be something distinct from the information about the apple and the responses that are generated. We could imagine a robotic creature that can take in information in that way, broadcast that information to all sorts of control systems, use that information to control its behavior, but not have the actual experience of an apple. It's not have this inner appleness, this inner experience of redness and shininess and so on. And this inner aspect to experience, this private aspect to experience, this non-functional aspect of experience is sometimes referred to as, it's sometimes spoken of as qualia, that just means qualities, or phenomenal properties to do with the feel of the thing. Subjective feels subjective because it's private. It happens just in your mind. A neuroscientist wouldn't be able to detect this. They would be able to detect all the informational processes that I talked about. They won't be able to detect this private feel, though, what it's like for you, what its likeness, or in general, phenomenality and phenomenal consciousness. Now, these phenomenal properties, they're very unusual properties. They're very unlike the other sorts of properties that we're familiar within the world, the sort of properties that science can study. They're often said to be ineffable. You can't really describe what it's like to see redness. It's just it's just what the experience that red things create in you. But if I ask you to describe that and tell me whether it's the same experience, whether you have the same red experience that I do when we both look at something we call red, well, how do you do that? You just say, what's it's got that feel to it that red things have. And you can compare it perhaps with other colors and say it's more like yellow than it is like blue, say, but still that's not getting me anywhere if I don't already know what those colors are like for you. It's often said to be intrinsic. That is, it's not a matter of its relations to other things. I mean, the informational processes I talk about, they can be described in relational terms. The informational processes are telling you about something else. The feel here is not telling you anything. It's just what it's like to see the apple in itself. Okay, it's not conveying information about the apple. It's just what the experience of having information about the apple is like from the inside, as it were. It's often said to be known directly. You may be wrong about there being an apple there, but you couldn't be wrong about there being the feel of seeing an apple in your mind. It's often said to be private and subjective. Again, as I said earlier, the neuroscientists wouldn't be able to detect this feel of experience in your brain. They'd be able to map all the things that your brain is doing, but what it's actually like for you on the inside, as it were, subjectively, they wouldn't be able to tell. And maybe different people have different kinds of experience, have different qualia when they see the same thing. Maybe when I look at an apple, it's like that from the inside, or when you look at an apple, it's like that. And when someone else looks at it, it's like that, and when someone else like that. We all agree that the thing that causes these experiences we call red. We all agree which things cause these experiences. But what they're like on the inside, we don't know. So it's these private properties, these qualia, are distinct from the worldly properties they're associated with. So we can all agree that the apple has some sort of surface properties that cause it to reflect light of certain wavelengths, and that's what we call red. That's what it is for a thing in the world to be red. But what mental qualities those red things produce in us, well, that could be anything. We don't know. We don't know what other people's experiences are like. And this now seems to be a completely different kind of problem. Explaining consciousness in this sense, consciousness as phenomenality, as qualia, as feel, this seems to be a totally different problem. Quite unlike the problem of explaining the things the brain does. And here's a quotation from David Chalmers. He says, why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, the sort of thing I was talking about to begin with, why is it that we have visual or auditory experience, the quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle C? How can we explain why there is something it is like to entertain a mental image or to experience an emotion? It's widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. If any problem qualifies as the problem of consciousness, it's this one. So note here that the question isn't about the existence of something separate from the brain. It's not about the existence of a soul or something separate from the brain. That's a totally separate question. Chalmers is agreeing that consciousness, whatever it is produced somehow by the brain. But he's saying that it's more than just the functions the brain performs, the information processing functions, the engagement with the world. It also somehow creates this private inner world of qualia. And explaining that is what he calls the hard problem. And it really is a very hard problem indeed. It's not the problem of explaining any abilities or reactions. No kind of story we give about what the brain does, about the mechanisms in the brain and the effects of those mechanisms. None of that will explain phenomenal consciousness, because phenomenal consciousness is not, and this way of thinking about it, it's not a matter of certain functions being performed, of the brain doing something. It's a matter of there being an internal feel, a private inner feel to those functions. And just describing the functions and explaining how they're performed won't solve this at all. All of the abilities and reactions can be functionally explained, but explaining the pure feel of the experience, that can't be done in functional terms, because it's not a matter of functions at all. It's a matter of pure feel. And so there are these famous examples. I'm sure many of you will know them. We can imagine a neuroscientist who knows everything about the physical processes involved in color vision. She knows all the neuroscience of color vision, but if she's never actually seen colors herself, if she's grown up in a black and white environment, there'll still be something about color vision that she doesn't know, namely what it's actually like to see colors. Knowing what the brain does doesn't tell you what it feels like to be a brain that does those things. And if she's never had color vision, color experiences herself, she won't know this aspect of color vision. And similarly, we can imagine creatures whose brains perform all the functions that ours perform, but which don't have this inner life at all. It's all dark inside, as David Chalmers puts it. So the moral of that is that nothing we learn about what the brain does, nothing that neuroscience can tell us, will ever explain consciousness in this sense. So if this is the problem of consciousness, then really we've got a very, very hard problem, almost an impossible problem, you might say. In response to that, there are various lines people can take. One is to just accept that these phenomenal properties are not physical properties. They're not properties that can be studied by the physical sciences at all. They're non-physical properties that the brain somehow produces. That's a line that many people pursue. The difficulty, of course, is then explaining how these non-physical aspects of the world relate to the physical aspects. If the feel of pain is a non-physical aspect of the world, how does it have any effect on the world? How does it affect our behavior, given that our bodies are physical? How can this non-physical aspect affect the physical world, affect our physical bodies? Another option, which is quite popular at the moment, is to suppose that these phenomenal properties are a feature of all matter, that everything in the world has these phenomenal properties. Electrons have a little bit of this inner life, and that the inner life we experience is a result of combining the inner lives of all the little particles in our brains, taking it as a fundamental feature of reality, so that we can't explain it because it's fundamental. It's a basic aspect of reality. Another option is to be a physicalist and to say that these phenomenal properties are, despite appearances, just physical ones. So when we talk about the feel of experience, all we're talking about really is some, say, pattern of neuron firing in the brain. Now, that's probably the dominant view among Western philosophers and the analytic tradition, but it seems to me a very difficult one to maintain. How could that feel, what its likeness of experience, just be a pattern of electrical activity in my brain? That seems to me something I can't make sense of, that identity. And should we just accept that there are these features of the brain that are these features of our that are produced by the brain, but that we just can't accept? I can't explain them. There's just some irreducible mystery to consciousness. There's an explanatory gap. Those are some lines that people take. I suggest a different line, and I'll just briefly introduce that. And it's this. I call it illusionism. It's not a position I invented. It's been around for many years. Daniel Dennett is the best known advocate of it. And And he's talked about, he's used the notion of illusion frequently in talking about consciousness. Now, the central claim is simply that these phenomenal properties don't exist. It's a mistake to think that there's an inner life like that we have a private world of mental qualities like this. Consciousness is simply informational fame. To have a conscious experience simply is for information about the world to be having all sorts of effects on you, on your cognitive system, for you to be in that kind of rich engagement with the world that I depicted on the earlier diagram with the arrows, the red and green arrows. So there's no hard problem. There isn't a problem of explaining how qualia come to exist, how phenomenal properties are produced by the brain, because they don't exist at all. They're not, the brain doesn't produce them. But, and this is the second part of illusionism, the illusionists agree that phenomenal properties seem to exist in some sense. It's quite natural to think they exist. And that's what needs explaining, not how they come to exist, because they don't exist, but how we come to think they exist. So it replaces the hard problem of explaining what these properties are and how the brain produces them with a different problem of explaining how we come to think that these properties exist. I've called that the illusion problem. David Chalmers calls it the meta problem. It's not the problem of, it's not the hard problem, it's the problem of why we think there's a hard problem. Meta problem in that sense. So, well, how do we come to think that our brains have produced this private world of qualities? Well, just in outline, it goes something like this. We're not just aware of the world, we're also aware of our own experiences. Experiences being understood as these patterns of informational fame. So we can recognize not just things in the world, but also our own states of mind, our own experiences. We can recognize when we're having a certain kind of experience, we can describe the experience, and we can react to the experience itself. And we can do that in virtue of mechanisms of introspection. So the idea is this, there's a second loop, if you like. There's the first loop of information and reaction which puts us in contact with the world, and then there's a second loop which puts us in contact with our contact with the world, with that first loop. So mechanisms of introspection monitor our experiences, by which I mean the informational and reactive processes that I talked about, not qualia, and that then supply information about those processes to higher level control systems, and which then generate further reactions. So the first loop puts us in contact with the apple, if you like, and the second loop puts us in contact with our experience of the apple. So what happens is we don't just notice things in the world and react to them, we notice our noticing and we react to our reacting. Okay. But this information that we get about our own experience, about our own informational and reactive processes, it's very schematic, it's very impressionistic, it's partial, limited, distorted, sketchy, caricatured, and it creates the impression of there being this private inner world when we're asked to say, so we can, thanks to these introspective processes, we can recognize when we're in a certain first order informational state, when we're getting information about an apple and reacting to an apple, we can recognize that we're in that state and we can react to that state. We can say, I'm in that state again, that state of detecting something that's red, whatever. And we can tell people about it, but we don't have enough information to describe it in detail, to say it's a complex pattern of informational and reactive processes. We don't have all that neuroscientific detail. All we can say is it's one of those the state that an apple produces in me. And so we have this very simplistic caricatured kind of way of describing our experiences. And that's what we're gesturing at when we use, when we talk of qualia. It's a kind of caricature of what's really happening. So phenomenal properties, really, they only exist as objects of our beliefs about ourselves. The brain does things that we describe in terms of phenomenal properties. We say it's doing at what's really happening, about the processes that introspection is tracking. But it's not, we take it to think that really is a thing called engagement with the world, courtesy of the first set of loops, and also with its and it's also an engagement with themselves, and that's what creates the sense of there being an internal world. But it's not something mysterious and separate from what the brain is doing. It's just another thing that the brain is doing, another kind of engagement that the brain is constructing. And so finally, I will stop there and let you ask some questions. But here I also asked Dali to paint illusionism as a theory of consciousness, and it came up with these. And I rather like these. I didn't give it any more instructions than just the name, illusionism as a theory of consciousness, and it came up with these spirals. There are a few inner glows there as well, but it came up with these spirals at the bottom there. And I think that's a really nice, left in a private world that no one, we can understand each other, we can understand our own minds, we can understand other people's minds. And I think that ultimately live together more harmoniously. Okay, I'll leave it there. That's my brief introduction, and you can ask me questions. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for your wonderful
and how we can have a kind of a non-physical thing affect the physical world, and if the world is causally closed, then we're going to have a problem. So you suggest that this might be an illusion. Well, okay, that's an interesting suggestion, but how do you prove that? So to me, it looks like what you're saying is a speculation. So we have a speculation. Maybe it's an illusion. How do we go about proving that?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Well, I'm suggesting this is a matter of science. Now, science doesn't prove things. It provides theories and tests them, and sees if it provides. We test a theory by seeing if it's useful, if it explains things, if it removes puzzlement, if it allows us to make good predictions. Now, I think what we need to do here is start trying to explain these mechanisms that I've talked about, the mechanisms of engagement with the world, first order perceptual consciousness, and then the mechanisms of introspection and their effects. Work on that, and then see how that affects our intuitions ultimately. The core intuition about consciousness is that those stories leave something out. That these stories about what the brain is doing leave something out. And that we can imagine a zombie whose brain does all of those things but still isn't conscious. Now, my claim is that that's because we have such a very sketchy understanding of what the brain is doing and what introspection is doing. So my prediction would be that as we build better and better accounts of those things by doing science, by doing cognitive science and neuroscience, we will gradually lose the sense that anything is left out. We will say, yes, that's what my perceptual systems are doing, and this is what introspection is doing, and it's leading me to conceptualize what's happening in this way, and so on and so on. Yeah, and that's all that's happening, really. As the science improves, we will lose the sense that there's something left out. Now, so that's the prediction, really, that our intuitions will change as we develop the kind of stories that I'm suggesting we should develop. Now, if in, say, 100 years or 200 years, we've developed those stories in great detail, yet we still feel, no, there's something completely missing from this. We haven't really explained consciousness itself at all. Well, then I suppose that would start to count against the view that I'm suggesting. But my proposal is that we work on that and see how far the scientific story takes us, rather than just trusting these intuitions we have about zombies and Mary and so on, and building elaborate metaphysical stories about panpsychism or property dualism or whatever, that really at our present state of knowledge, it's kind of a waste of time to build those stories. Let's see how far the obvious scientific story can take us before we go down this route.
So this is interesting, but one question that I always have is that, to me, it feels like that we have an elephant in the room, and that's the quality that we feel. And one way to solve the problem is to say that there's no elephant. The other way is to try to explain what the elephant is doing, which we cannot do. One of the questions that I always have for philosophers is that why can we have the stance to say, okay, well, there's an elephant. We have probably no way up until now of explaining how consciousness arises or interacts with the brain. But why can't we just stay there, just to say, well, something exists, we cannot explain it because it doesn't come under the neuroscientific methods of reductionist things. I mean, can't that be a defendable position to have? Or can there be things in the world that we cannot understand? That's it. We know it exists, but we cannot understand it.
Absolutely. My claim isn't that those views couldn't be right, that my view has to be right. No, I'm suggesting that we explore this line alongside those other ones. The problem with the other ones is that if you accept that there's some irreducible mystery, then you kind of just stop there. There's nothing else really to do except say, yes, there's just this thing that happens and it's a mystery and that's it. And that's not, I think, a good strategy. I mean, if we'd done that, say, with life and said, look, there's just some things that just have life and some things that don't, but we can't explain it, that wouldn't have had a good effect on progress in biology. So yes, that's a possible view, and it could even be right. But let's also look at the possibility that this elephant in the room, there is, in the sense that there is an elephant in the room. It's our convictions, our beliefs about qualia, about this world. That we can all agree. We all have this sense that there's something more. The question is, should we trust that sense? Is it an elephant or just a sort of elephant hologram? And it's at least worth exploring the hypothesis that maybe it isn't really an elephant. It's just something that looks a bit like that makes us think it's an elephant. Let's explore that because we know how to do that. At least we can work on that. And everyone agrees that we need to explain our intuitions, our judgments, our reports about consciousness. Chalmers, who certainly thinks the elephant is real, also thinks we have to explain our judgments about the elephant, our beliefs about the elephant. And he thinks that we could probably do that without actually mentioning the elephant. He thinks we can probably do that in physical terms. This is what he calls the paradox of phenomenal judgment. He thinks that our phenomenal judgments can probably be explained without actually mentioning phenomenal properties themselves. And if that's true, then it puts us in a very strange position. It's like people that have used this analogy. It's like somebody who believes in UFOs and says they've had all these experiences of UFOs. And then you explain to them, you take them to the locations or whatever, and you look at the dates and the times, and you show them that in each case, there was some natural explanation of why they believed there was a UFO. There was some strange cloud formation. There was a satellite. There was the planets were in a funny position, whatever. In every case, you show them that their beliefs about the UFOs were the product of other factors, other things, natural phenomena, whatever. And they accept all that, but then say, I still believe in UFOs. There still was a UFO there, really, even though you've shown me that my beliefs about it weren't caused by it. And that's the danger, that's what's going to happen for people who believe in qualia. They're going to say, well, you can explain my beliefs about qualia in scientific terms, but you can't explain qualia themselves in scientific terms. Now, if we do get to that point, then I think the pressure is really going to be on the realists to continue defending the reality of something if their beliefs about it aren't actually produced by it.
Thank you so much. I let other people ask questions, and I would like to extend an invitation. Hopefully next time we can have you in person in Iran. That would be great.
If I could do that, it would be lovely.
Yes,
I don't know if it's possible, but
yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Cannot say.
So maybe we go for the next question. If anyone got a question, otherwise I have a question.
I have a question.
Okay, Mr. Ahmadi, go on.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Actually, I'm not good to English, but you talk about consciousness. What is your idea about unconsciousness? What's your idea about unconsciousness?
That's a very good question, actually. In a way, consciousness. In the past, people tended to think that the mind just was consciousness. The mind was everything that is present to our consciousness, and if it's not present to our consciousness, it's not part of the mind. Now, since Freud introduced the idea of there being an unconscious mind, which is manifest in our reactions to the world, the idea is that a lot of what we do is the product of unconscious mental processes. You can see that these are going on because of our reactions. Often, in Freud's case, these were maladaptive reactions. They were pathological symptoms. But since that time, it's become very common in cognitive science to assume that a lot of our behavior is produced by non-conscious processes. I mean, these words that I'm speaking now, I'm not pre-planning them consciously. They're just coming to my lips. And if I did think about them consciously, I might decide, no, actually, I won't say that. I'll say something. Unconscious processes are taking care of my speech, and they take care of most of what we do. If you walk down a busy street, you don't consciously
show the other something deep in every mind.
It's from this perspective, it seems that the mind is mostly unconscious. And if you think of the mind as what's producing our behavior, our reactions, most of it seems to be produced without conscious thought. We only think consciously when things aren't going smoothly. If you're playing sports, for instance, you don't think consciously about what you're doing. You just that interrupts it. You just play. Consciousness kicks in when there's a problem with the automatic, fluid, non-conscious behavior. So from this perspective, it can seem that unconsciousness, as it were, or non-consciousness, is the normal state of functioning, and consciousness is just a kind of it's when the autopilot goes off and the pilot has to intervene. So in that sense, I think that much of the mind is non-conscious. Of course, that's different from being unconscious in the sense of being comatose or something. When you have an operation and you're then of course you're not responding at all. But I think there's a lot of mental activity that is non-conscious. I'm not sure if that actually addresses your question. There are other ways of thinking about the unconscious in terms of a.
I learned. Thank you a lot.
So maybe Amir Reza ask the next question.
Yes, thank you for your great talk. I wanted to ask about the role of self in your theory. You know, I think that if you say that something is experiencing some kind of illusion, so you should assume that there is a self, and that self in your theory, I think you're changing the elephant from the experience to the self, and that self is, I think you should assume that that has some kind of metaphysical properties, which it is experiencing the illusion.
That's a nice question. It's one that often comes up. I don't want to do that. I want to say that what we have here are patterns of reaction to the world and reaction to our own reactions to the world. There doesn't need to be some central system in there that is doing the reacting. The reacting is done by my brain. There's no small, the self is just me, here's the self, and talks and walks and plays sport and whatever. This is the self, smaller self inside, either in the brain or was what the senses are. They receive the information from the senses and then decides how to react. No, I decide, and I decide in virtue of all kinds of processes in my brain, but those processes aren't themselves processes of a self. They add up to a self. It's like, I mean, if suppose there were a self inside me, either physical or non-physical, how would it work? How would it make decisions? Well, there'd have to be some sort of processes inside the self to make the decisions and to make to take him to interpret the information it was receiving and generate reactions to that information. And so, you know, you'd still have to go inside the self. Well, why not just have this as the self and all the processes be the ones in my brain?
Yes.
So I reject that. I reject this idea of internalizing the self, and similarly internalizing experience. This
So
is
why
the experience.
it's why it is our experience of self is abstract, you know, why is it like that?
I think I mean, we do have a sense of self. Again, I don't deny that we have a sense of self, but I think that's again to do with things like introspection and modeling of our own. Well, we tell ourselves stories. We create stories about our own lives, narratives, which link our past experiences to our present experiences and project them into the future in terms of plans and projects that we have. And it's these stories that we tell that give that create the sense of there being a persisting thing here that persists throughout all the changes. What persists is, as it were, the narrator. This is an idea from Daniel Dennett. What persists is the narrator of this story that I tell. But the narrator isn't actually a physical thing. It's just a kind of, it's an abstraction from the story, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
Essentially, my view is that we're taking kind of useful fictions, useful ways of conceptualizing ourselves, or ourselves being these whole persons, and we're taking them too literally. We're taking them as picking out real things, selves and experiences and things, and giving them a reality that, I mean, they do. It's useful to talk in these terms. It captures something, but we're giving them a kind of reality they don't have, and then puzzling ourselves trying to explain them. It's like trying to say it's like reading, say, the Sherlock Holmes stories, and then worrying about who Sherlock Holmes really was, and where does he live? I mean, he lives at this house, but in London, but you know, where is that London? Where is that house? Where is it's not anywhere. It's a fiction.
Yes, but isn't it the base of everything for us? You know, the base of any kind of thinking, the base of any kind of experience, the base of even you making these theories. You know, the base of everything. So what's the base?
Well, I don't think there is a base. That's the thing. I don't think there is a base. I think what we do is we don't come into the world like sort of mathematicians, starting with axioms like Euclid, and these are the axioms. Then we're inferring things from this and starting with sense experience and constructing the idea of a world. Well, we just start in the world. Children don't infer the existence of an external world from their private experience. They just see the world around them, the rooms and the furniture and the people and the chairs and the tables and this is where you start. You start with this whole bunch of beliefs about the world, about yourself. And then as you learn more about the world, maybe as you learn about perception, you start to create theories about things. And you
Thank you for your answer. Yes, yes.
You maybe start to create this theory that what you really are aware of is this private inner world, and that you infer the external world from that. But that's a theory. You started as a child just living in the world. So I don't think there is a base. There's just a network and a web of belief, as Klein put it, a web of belief. And you can adjust this web in any way that you want, really, to find the best fit with the rest of your beliefs.
Thanks a lot.
No, you're welcome.
So, still taking questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to go on if you know, I'm enjoying this. Good questions, excellent questions.
Thank you. Mahdi, probably. Yeah, Mahdi. Next question.
Hello. Thank
Hello.
you for your great talk. And my question and theoretical computer science. In computer science, our main problem is just to create a system that can interact with humans. The question here is, you define consciousness as some illusion. Does this illusion have any important property that make it necessary for our intelligence? This is my first question. And my second question is, how would you like to extend your definition of consciousness to any other intelligent systems? I mean, if I have another intelligent system which can think about his thinking, reason about his reasoning, would you call it conscious? Or how would you explain your idea in other intelligent systems?
Terrific. That's a great question. That's a really great question. So what you're really asking me about is the function of this illusion. Is it helpful to a creature to think about, to conceptualize itself in this way? And would artificial creatures that have the same abilities be subject to the same illusion? I think the way to think about this is in terms of social creatures. Why is it helpful to us to have that second loop to introspect and to be able to conceptualize our own experiences? I mean, after all, it's the world we need to deal with. We need to deal with the world around us, with the tigers attacking us and the apples that we want to eat, and so why do we need to also engage with our own minds? You might think, let's just engage with the world. Leave it at that. We don't need to have the illusion of a private world. And I think that's what consciousness is like for most animals. They're just engaged with the world. They're tightly locked onto the world and busy dealing with the world. They don't need to deal with their own minds as well, with their own experiences. So why do we? Well, I think because we're social creatures. And so it's useful to us to have some conception of how we're engaged with the world. Okay, so say something affects us something is quite unpleasant. We taste some fruit and it's very bitter and makes us feel sick. It's useful for us as social creatures to be able to tell other people about that and say, don't taste that. It's horrible. Now, other animals can't do that. They maybe have simple signaling systems and things that can warn about predators and so on, but they can't reflect on their own experience, conceptualize it, and report it to other people and say, that tastes horrible. Can't do that. It's useful to us to be able to do that. This also enables us to adopt strategies for producing experiences that we like and avoiding ones that we don't. It gives us a second level of control that's particularly useful, I think, for social creatures. We can share information about how certain things affect us. In fact, that second loop, what it's monitoring is, if you like, the significance of things in the world. The first loop is locking us onto the world and enabling us to respond to the world in an appropriate way. The second loop is monitoring how that happens and monitoring the significance that things in the world are having for us. And that's very useful for social creatures. So, to come to artificial intelligences, if our AIs were interacting with each other and with us, then yes, I think it would be very useful for them to have something like this. Some sort of this second loop thing. Now, would that mean that they were subject to the same illusion that we are? I don't know. It depends. I think to some extent, the way we conceptualize consciousness is a product of culture, a product of a certain Western tradition in philosophy. I take it that everyone has these. All humans have these introspective abilities.
Do you have any idea in your mind that we could quantize our definition of consciousness? I mean, we can call a system conscious. For example, give a system a number from 0 to 1 that we can give him a consciousness, you know, because reasoning about own reason, thinking about own thinking, we have supervised system, we have a lot of systems that can control other systems, and they are not I don't think they are conscious, you know.
They're certainly not conscious in the way that we are, because they are, compared to us, they are very, very simple systems. I mean, even though they are quite, you know, I know they're quite complicated systems, quite clever systems, but compared to us, they're simple. But I think they have a bit of what we have. They have, I don't think, this way, the way of thinking, look, when I talked about those, you know, the loops and so on, this is there's no hard and fast definition of being conscious or not conscious on this. There's being engaged with the world, and that engagement can be more or less rich. It can be very simple, as in, say, a bacterium, or it can be very rich, as in us. And there's a continual gradation. There's no point in that where something, you know, something qualitative happens, where a light comes on or something like that. There's nothing like that. There's just increasing complexity in this engagement with the world. Similarly, with this higher order monitoring, you can have very simple monitoring, and then you can have richer and richer and richer and richer. And again, there's no point where something changes completely from non-conscious to conscious. You get to where we are, and then we say you're conscious. You reduce the level of this complexity, and eventually you get to a point where you say it's conscious. But there isn't some distinct point in the in between where it's just vague. And this idea of measuring consciousness, again, I think that is more suited to the inner light view, like in IIT, Integrated Information Theory, where they actually have a measure of, it's supposed to be, as it were, like a measure of strength of the inner light, but there's no inner light measure. You can just map the complexity of the engagement, both at the first order and the higher order, and then consciousness isn't a precise scientific term that can be given a number and that can be associated with specific, very specific mechanisms. No, you get to a point where you're in the realm of talking about consciousness.
Scientific progress, and they're not illusionists, so.
These are great questions, by the way. Everybody, all the questions have been wonderful. Yes, well, you probably guess that I'm not a fan of IIT, because it is taking that.
Yeah, I realize that.
That view of consciousness that I don't like, and they're trying to provide a scientific account of that thing, that private thing, and they're identifying it with a certain sort of informational complexity. Now, they have this mathematical construction, and they say that, you know, that's what consciousness in this phenomenal sense is, and they base it on a bunch of axioms which are derived from introspection. So what they're doing is they're trusting these intuitions we have about consciousness, which I say are really an illusion, but they're trusting those intuitions. And they're saying, okay, so what would consciousness look like in the brain if those intuitions about it were true? And they say, well, it would have to look something like this. And then they come up with this mathematical formula, this kind of sort of information. And so they base the scientific account on taking the intuition seriously. And then they try and look at structures in, measure the informational complexity, I'm not explaining this very well, in the brain, and in the light of that, that theory. Now, the trouble is that that sort of measure of informational complexity, it turns out that on that definition, all sorts of things that we don't normally think of as being conscious are conscious. So a very suitable array of switches, simple on-off switches that were connected up in the right way would be highly conscious in this way, because it's a matter of the informational the connectivity within them. And also it has consequences that, say, just knocking out one single neuron might make the difference between your being conscious or not conscious. All depends on the connectivity. And they accept this, and they say, yeah, we have to accept that they would be conscious. But it's all just rooted in taking those intuitions seriously. There's no way ultimately of testing it, because what they're trying to, you can test for whether there's this kind of informational complexity, but you can't test whether that really is accompanied by this inner feel, because you can't get into somebody's head and see if it's there. You can say this connection of this bunch of switches has a high phi, and so therefore, according to the theory, it should be conscious. But you can't actually be the bunch of switches and see if you can see if it's conscious, see if it has an inner life to it. So it's completely untestable, and it's. I think it's a really good example of what happens when you take the intuition, the illusion seriously and try to mathematicize it. You end up with these things, but there's nothing you can do with it. You can't. It doesn't predict anything that's not predicted by the neuroscience independently. You've just got to take it on faith that it's mapping the inner reality of consciousness, and it's so counterintuitive in its consequences that I don't. It doesn't seem to be getting at the thing that I'm interested in consciousness, which is a thing that is important. It seems to me that consciousness, when we say that something's conscious, that's an important feature. It's an important feature of my engagement with the world. This bunch of switches that's wired up in the right way doesn't seem to be engaged with anything. But according to IIT, it has a high level of phi. So it's almost like what you call a reductio ad absurdum of the whole idea of taking it seriously to me. Sorry, that was a bit rambling as an explanation, but I should try and do better sometime, but I think it's a dead end.
No, thank you. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Just one more and last question by Puya. Are you still there, Puya? Seems not. Okay. I think we can end it here. Yeah. Thanks, Keith, for your wonderful talk, your patience, and
hello. Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. Can I ask my question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. First, thank you very much for your great talk. I had another question. You categorized our consciousness about the apple and about our phenomena about or feeling about the apple, about two cycles or two levels of neural processes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. So my question is this. We understand a specific statement. We say, I understand the apple and I understand my understanding or consciousness of the apple. Mm-hmm. In both of these, I say I. And this self-consciousness is conscious or understands the thing. It is one same thing is the subject of these two consciousnesses. But I think this seems somehow conflicting with the two-level hypothesis that you stated.
Oh, so yes, again, it's the way about the self. It's the self that is the fact that I am experiencing the apple and I am also experiencing my own experience of the apple. So who's the I in this? There seems to be some self that is involved in both of these levels that seems to be something separate from them. Is that the idea? Is that the worry? That there seems to be an I, that I'm talking about an I that's experiencing the apple and an I that's experiencing my experience of the apple, but what is this I referring to? Is that the worry? Is that the question?
I'm sorry, I missed your voice a little.
Yeah,
Would you please,
I'll just answer. I'll just assume that was the question and answer, and then but yes. So there's a difficulty in explaining this, I think, because I have to talk about us doing things. Now, we are experiencing the apple, and we're experiencing our experience of the apple. Who's this first person referring to? It sounds like there's some separate thing that's experiencing each of these things. Well, no, that's not the idea. This is just the limits of language. I have to talk in this way. I suppose, talk more impersonally in terms of the brain processors locking the organism, the whole organism, onto the apple, and then brain processors within the organism making the organism sensitive to its own experiences. And I think I could say everything that I really want to say in that impersonal way that a scientist would say. But the point is, when I put it in my own mouth, then I have this vocabulary of, this personal vocabulary of I see things. I don't say, oh, this organism here is detecting the presence of an apple. I say, I can see the apple. I'm not saying something different there. That's not I'm not talking about a different thing, the I from the organism. And these informational processes are not different from my seeing the apple.
Yes.
It's a different way of talking, a different way of talking about the same thing, and it's one that's adapted to social communication, to communication with other people. So it's yes.
Yes, of course. But another question is that we may think we may consider another paradigm or basis to investigate the problem of consciousness, using the consciousness itself, the more fundamental conscious types that we have. In this sort, we have some texts about our previous philosophers that make the idea that the conscious is the same.
Signals, it's broken up, hasn't it?
Yeah, it seems so.
Same as the consciousness. There's a unity between them about the idea. Then this would be then this would be with moral processes and different levels. What's your idea about this? Thanks.
I missed most of the question there, I'm afraid. You're suggesting that we could start with consciousness and treat it as fundamental. Is that the idea?
I said the basic statement was that the conscious person is same as his consciousness. When a person understands about his self-consciousness, he's exactly that consciousness itself. We say the phenomena I that I understand. It's exactly I'm exactly this my understanding.
Yeah, I'm not.
And if we consider this, this should not.
It's breaking up so badly that I can't really understand, and I don't want to
equal with the.
I'm sorry. The connection broke up there, and I couldn't.
Maybe he
Right.
writes down the question.
I don't want to reply to a question that wasn't what you were asking, and I couldn't.
Yeah, your connection is not stable.
Did anyone rephrase it? Did anyone hear it?
Do you hear?
Mm-hmm.
Can you write it down, your question, Priya?
Okay. Thanks.
I'd just like to say how great the questions have been. I mean, I'm really enjoying these questions. They're it's a really interesting discussion. Just waiting for the question. I mean, I find that talking about this and listening to people's questions and answering their questions is a better way of explaining my position than just presenting a talk. The trouble with presenting a talk is that you're presenting it to an imaginary listener who has a certain amount of knowledge and no more, and a certain expectations and so on. But when you engage with people individually, It's much more interesting because you see that some things you just don't need to tell them because they already understand that. And other things that you thought they would probably have understood or probably known, they need you to explain. And so it's much more interesting and profitable, I think, to talk individually than to have... I found this, I had a workshop recently on introspection that was run by people in Bristol, and the talks were very short, just 15-minute talks.
Right.
And the rest of it was discussion. And it went much better because it's kind of boring listening to people talking.
Yeah.
Right, so do we have the question? I'm not seeing it written.
Maybe I ask a question. Yeah.
Yeah.
And okay. I was wondering, let's suppose that consciousness, let's agree with you that consciousness is illusion. And let's again suppose that you have a successful account of how it's generated. The second part for me is very important.
Mm.
The next question is that what's the function of that illusion? Let's suppose it's illusion. I mean, do you have an story, an evolutionary story for that, or do you think you need that story?
That's a great question. Look, I want to distinguish two things. I want to distinguish this this second loop I described, this kind of self-monitoring, self-modeling.
Yeah.
I don't think that necessarily brings in any illusion. Okay, I think that just brings in a certain ability to recognize our own experiences, to say, oh, this is the same experience that I had the other day, and I don't like this one, or that was nice, I'll try and produce that one again, and whatever, without overlaying it with any conception of qualia and private mental world and hard problems and all of this. I think that comes when you try and do philosophy on the result, on what that second loop does is produce certain sorts of reports, descriptions of your experience. Just as the first loop provides you with the ability to report on, react to the world, the second loop gives you the ability to report on your experience and talk to you about your experiences and talk about what your experiences are like. Okay. Then people come along and do philosophy on that, and they say this, what it's like. When you're talking about what your experience is like, you're talking about some strange property of the experience. It's what it is likeness, and you make it in from the experience is like this, it has a what it is likeness. And what is that? Now, then here's where the real illusion comes in. What the second loop does is kind of invite this conceptualization of experience as phenomenality, as a Cartesian world. But you have, I think, to take a further step and do philosophy to actually get that illusion. So now what's the function? Let me remember where your question was. The question about the function of it. The function of the second loop, I think, is pretty obvious. It allows you certain sorts of control, self-control. It allows you to share information about how the world is affecting you. It's quite easy to see why it'd be useful for a social creature to have that second loop. The illusion itself is that actually, the elaborated illusion, the illusion that comes from conceptualizing it in a certain way, is that adaptive? Now, if you ask, say, Daniel Dennett, he'll say, no, it's just a product of bad philosophy, and we just need to get people to stop doing it. But if you talk to other philosophers, particularly, I don't know if you know the work of Nicholas Humphrey. He wrote a lovely book called Soul Dust in 2011 that I really like. And he thinks that the full-blown illusion is adaptive. And he thinks natural selection actually shaped shaped the monitoring process to create that rich metaphysical illusion, that sense of our having, of being metaphysically special, of having a soul that's distinct from our bodies, that's of immense value and immense richness and so on. He thinks that was deliberately crafted, it was crafted by natural selection because it's highly adaptive for us to have it. It gives us it makes the first order engagement with the world much richer when we see ourselves as being these creatures with these special metaphysical properties. It makes our interactions with each other more special because we see ourselves as interacting not just with other biological organisms, but with these creatures with a metaphysical glow inside them that makes them special. So he sees it as being highly adaptive. Now, I don't know. Some people would say, as Dennett says, that it's just a sort of philosophical error. Others, like Humphrey, that it's highly adaptive. I don't know. This is an interesting question. The prior question, I think, is how common that elaboration is. I mean, if you look at people doing XFI, many, experimental philosophy, it seems that intuitions about zombies and Mary and so on are not as widespread as philosophers think they are. And certainly there are philosophical traditions such as Buddhism, which seem to get along quite well without them. Buddhism arguably is there are certain strands in it anyway, are very illusionist. So I think we need to look at how, I mean, this is an interesting area for research, sociological research in part, about how far people share these intuitions and what role these intuitions play for them. Do they find them helpful? But I would certainly encourage you to have a look at, if you're interested in this, to have a look at Nick's book, Soul Dust. It's very interesting. He's got a new one coming out this year about animal consciousness. So I think this is an open question is the answer. But again, I see this as a much more interesting and fruitful line of inquiry than just sort of facing ourselves with this blank wall of a hard problem. And
one more related thing regarding the second part. I mean, your account of how illusion is generated, right? It seems you got two options there. You can do your account at the mind level or brain level, or both maybe. But which one you are more inclined to? I mean,
well, they're just.
Are you working on that? I mean, are you trying to make it more specific and elaborate account of how illusion is generated, or?
I see this. Look, this is there's two issues here. One is trying to defend the general approach against the phenomenal realists, against the people who think there's a hard problem, and to suggest to people that that's a dead end really, and that this is where the interesting and productive research program is. And then there's the question of where you actually go once you consider this other research program, because there are lots and lots of ways of developing a non-phenomenal realist view of consciousness, many ways. And one thing I want to do, and I'm trying to do, is to sketch the different dimensions along which you could develop an illusionist approach. Now, I have my own particular path that I prefer down that in this landscape, but I just want people to explore the landscape really. As to at what level I'm doing it, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a cognitive scientist, so I'm doing it all at a fairly sketchy level. But I do enjoy reading neuroscience. I mean, last week I read the Anne-Sophie Barwich's book, wonderful book I recommend you, Smellosophy, about the neuroscience of smell. And what's fascinating about that is how when you get down into the neuroscience, you find that a lot of our intuitions about our understanding of what smell is doing break down. Smell isn't doing the kind of things we think it's doing. And this is, this is perhaps the most important lesson of what I'm trying to get across, is that the way we conceptualize our minds may be useful for certain purposes, but we shouldn't trust it too much. And there may be better ways of conceptualizing it that actually open up new opportunities for us, both in understanding ourselves and understanding each other, and maybe even, looking at it idealistically and living together and cooperating together. But to do this, you need to stop just trusting those old conceptions and start looking at what the science is telling us and what other theoretical options are available. So I'm getting a bit preachy there. So. It's always a danger. So do we have the other question? Yeah.
Thanks. Let's see. No, I don't see if we ask questions. So maybe we can end it here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you all. There's some terrific questions, and I'd be happy to continue sometime if you like. It was really great.
Thank you for your time, your brilliant discussion, and your patience. Thank you. That was a pleasure meeting you. Yeah.
You too. All of you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Merci.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, bye.
Bye-bye then.
Yeah.
See you again.
Bye.